I'd like to welcome our panelists to the stage. Megan Giannini of Lumileds, Mark Stewart of Airbus UK. We have Dawn Moore of Morgan & Sindall, and Indy Sierra of the London School of Economics. So if you guys can make your way up to the stage, and I'm going to just come over here. And we're going to talk about, what is the evolution of HR? Okay, there are so many issues that we're contending with, from culture to engagement. We talked about nationalization. We're not even going to get to all of them. We'll talk about robotics. And then one of the other questions is, what's the future evolution of the HR profession? So with that, let me get started. The challenge of making good business decisions is present in every area of management. But in a recent survey, only 18% of HR people felt that digital transformation has been integrated into their HR platforms. So what's the best practice suggestions that you have for your colleagues in HR at the leadership level on getting the right executive dashboard? These is actually the data you look at. Being able to digitally take what's going on in the business and bring it to your dashboard. What's the best practices to monitor both the tactical performance and strategic initiatives? What are the numbers that you folks look at? Let me start with you, Mark.
Well, I guess in my industry, I try and relate it to the product. And obviously, we make aircraft. So you could imagine building an aircraft that didn't have a heads-up display. So our pilots that are flying it don't understand what the airspeed is, what altitude they're flying at, what the fuel consumption would look like, or what direction they're pointing in. You wouldn't build it, would you? You wouldn't build it. Or you wouldn't certainly feel safe in flying it if your pilot was flying blind. And that for me is, links back to the quality of data that HR can provide to the business. And if we have good quality data, then it enhances our credibility, no ends. So for me, in terms of that dashboard, that heads-up display for our senior managers, it starts with what are your top priorities? What are your top goals? And then you build your dashboard accordingly. So whether it's around cost of labour, whether it's around inclusion and diversity, ethics and compliance, absence, accidents, well-being, whatever is key to your business, you build your dashboard around that. And I think the other key bit I would add to that is it's not just good enough to report on figures and trends. I think you need to dive deeper into the figures and trends, and you need to provide qualitative information along with quantitative information. So if I take, for example, our exit lever attrition targets that we have and we work on, we've now developed an online tool that individuals can go on and give us good quality reasons as to why they are deciding to leave our business so that we can take actions to prevent it. And I think the other key measure for me is obviously how people are feeling in your business. You can have all the great KPIs around cost of labour and so forth, but what is the real temperature within your business? And okay, we do annual surveys, etc., but the world's kind of moving on from that. So you've got to have real-time information now to help our managers navigate through that VUCA world and address some of the challenges that they face.
All right, I'm going to go to Indy in just a moment, but do you have to pull out of a number of systems, or do you have it pretty well integrated where the data comes to you out of a single dashboard?
If I'm being honest,
please,
and I'll be honest, it's a mixture of both. We've just launched a new platform, Workday, and we're navigating our way through Workday. And some of the dashboard that we have comes direct from that, and others we're still trying to navigate interfaces between Workday and other systems.
Indy, how about you? What's the dashboard you look at, and do you get it out of a single system, or do you have to sort of weave it together from a number of different data sources?
I think in LSE it's probably a little bit simpler in terms of the construction airline industry. So yes, there is a single system through which we can get most of the dashboard indices. But I think one of the reasons that percentage is so low is, and it was as low 30 years ago, is not that HR isn't making huge advancements, but the requirement of boards have changed. So if you look at the London School of Economics, the big emphasis on qualitative data. So staff tell us things, but they sell them in context. So the reasons why we might change through exit questionnaires are also a product of those people having left us and what they've got to tell us in terms of leaving. So what the organization's really interested in is, okay, why do people work with us? What state are they in when they work with us? And indeed, we want to know a lot about their well-being and mental health, partly because it's a big issue in the student environment of the university sector, but also because that then floats up into the staff environment. And if any of you knew a university, you'd know it's actually quite difficult to tell between a staff and a student. Yeah? 20% of our students are also staff at any one time. So just to give you an idea, where we're trying to connect with strategic initiatives with actual data on our staff, we're using a pilot product called Total Brain. I don't know if you've come across that, but it's a mental well-being product. We're trialing it on 50 different types of staff. And what it does is it tells you something independently about the mental well-being of staff. In addition to that, we're also, for the same group, trying to pilot through digital technology what we can learn about their health so that we can understand what are the longer-term impacts of somebody who spends 20 hours a day at work doing research, because that's what researchers tend to do. Quite hard if you're researching to actually get out of it. It's with you all of the time. And what is the longer-term impact of that? And that's what the board wants. And my board would say it's 18%, but it isn't for the same reason that it was 30 years ago. 30 years ago, we'd have a discussion as to whether payroll is accurate. Payroll is absolutely accurate, they get it. But it's that qualitative difference that then gives the edge for LSE over another competitor that allows them to say, and for these reasons, we have a fantastic story to tell for why new people want to join us.
Interesting. Well, all right. So let me go to Megan and Dawn here. So you both have come into companies where you've had to virtually create or recreate the HR infrastructure, okay, from sort of, either a prior life or a clean sheet of paper in Megan's case. And there's some, I'll help you with some of the distinctions. Megan's company makes LED lighting systems. They like the Eiffel Tower, by the way, as well as they make automotive headlamps as one of their big product lines and some other LED products. Morgan & Sindall, Dawn's company, is a construction firm, and Mark's company builds things, but we want Dawn's to stay in one place. So that's the big difference, right? We don't want buildings sliding around, if you will. So you both work for companies that are sort of, in industries that are not particularly considered progressive, maybe even considered old school. Yet you've both had great success in getting your executive, your chief executive, and your boards to buy into a much more progressive and comprehensive role for HR. And it's really led to some impressive business outcomes, in terms of retention and engagement numbers. Explain to the audience, how have you used data and reasoning to make the case to justify this very progressive approach to HR that you've both successfully implemented? Why don't we start with Dawn?
I think talking about the construction environment, first of all, one of the things that's very common is most of our people do not sit in an office, they don't sit at a desk, they're actually out on roads, in buildings, up scaffolding, that sort of thing. And that brings with it some quite specific operational challenges and actually some quite interesting data about how they need to work. It is also extremely difficult, as it is in manufacturing, where I've also spent quite a large part of my career to make money. And so therefore, any data from a people perspective, which gives intelligence to the business about how you make your ways of working more efficient, actually is quite key. So they've been two areas that certainly we've focused on to try and, I guess, create the case for a lot of the things that we've done in our people strategy. A great example, if I look at some of the operational challenges we have around health and safety, a lot of work in some areas of our business has to be done overnight because it's the only way it can be done. Mm-hmm. Picking up on Indy's point, that brings particular wellbeing challenges for your workforce and actually can bring a high degree of inefficiency because of fatigue. One of the things we deployed were actually what we call fatigue science bands, which gave us some great data. Our people wore them. You'll all know Fitbits. They're the health and safety equivalent of it. They monitor people's sleep patterns and actually the impact of fatigue when you're working overnight on operational efficiency. That gave us some great data to inform some of the things, for example, we've done around mental health and wellbeing, and actually improving some of our workplace conditions for our people. So I use that really as an example to say taking some quite operational challenges in our business, relating it to people, and then using, for example, a little bit of science and technology to generate data that resonates with our operational and commercial people about what the cost of not doing something differently is, has really helped the business case for some of the things that we've done. And I think, certainly from my time in manufacturing, that approach was also quite successful as well. I guess it's that old adage, pick the things that translate HR into the language of your business and ultimately the sector that you're in.
Yeah. How about you, Megan?
Yeah, I think this is an area that actually going from Philips, which had a lot of resources on data and analytics and metrics, to LumaLEDs, I was a little depressed about, honestly, because I had to manage my expectations around what systems do we have, what capabilities do we have, what resources do we have. And I think my takeaway, in many ways, but also with this topic, has been meet the business where they are and then bring them one step forward. So what worked for Philips is not what worked for LumaLEDs or needed to work for LumaLEDs. And I had to really understand where they are and what they need. I think absolutely matching the key metrics to what's relevant for the business is essential. But I also feel that having just a few core capability metrics that you're using to measure the things that are most critical has also been the most effective for us, right? So by listening and trying to understand where the business is and saying, okay, so for us right now, we're struggling. Our revenue has dropped in the last 2 years, so it's attrition, it's cost of HR as a % of revenue, it's headcount, which we're trying to drive down, actually, and then engagement, and those are the main ones that we're focused on. But what we've been able to do to kind of answer your question more specifically is, let's say, attrition. So we know that attrition's starting to go up. Well, how do you address that? Then we start to zoom into how effective are our reward programs, our long-term incentives, our short-term incentives, our spot bonus programs. So we have these 4 core top-level metrics, which are really relevant for the challenges our business is facing right now. And then we are able to drill down and start to say, all right, so we need to shift our reward strategy to address the attrition in certain areas, right? So in certain parts of the world, we're growing, but in others, we're shrinking. So we've just really done it in a differentiated way, but with just a few at the top that are most relevant for where we are.
And being able to translate this to the business executives using the numbers seems to have given you guys a pretty wide latitude to be able to experiment.
Yeah, absolutely. We do it as part of our monthly business planning process, right? So, and then as we say, okay, so what are we going to do about this data? It's just information. So what are our reflections on it? What action do we need to take? What additional information do we need? And then, how can that shift our people strategy? So, yep.
All right. Let me shift the topic a little bit now from the data and the systems to software robots, right? So we had a speaker at our North American event from a company that actually makes, called Automation Anywhere, that makes software robots. And during the course of a presentation to a small group of HRDs, she said, well, she has 67 robots in HR, but 13 of them qualify as digital workers. This is her term, not mine. Because those are programmed to look at all the tasks that are coming in and to prioritize, and they can perform multiple functions based on what the need that day is. And her argument was that those people had transcended software, or those programs, and now qualify as quote unquote digital workers. And the company's running around saying that they're going to be the largest employer on the planet because they'll have 2 million robots employed by X year, whatever. So I'm neither agreeing or arguing the point. I'm saying this is the perspective. So let me ask Mark, and I'm going to say specifically to the HR department versus the manufacturing side. Are you, quote unquote, using software robots or digital workers, whatever we're going to call it, to accomplish tasks specifically in the HR function? And how are you distinguishing the tasks that should be human? I mean, are you spending a lot of time thinking about what should the humans do versus, Hal from 2001: A Space Odyssey? All right. So how much time are you thinking about this issue of what should be software, robots, and what should be human? So Mark, why don't you go first?
I think the Industry 4.0 brings with it many different challenges, for sure. Both in terms of how you build product, how you service product. You can build new lines of business on big data, for sure. And we're doing that with some of our Skywise programs, where we're selling intelligence of our product and other products like Boeing and so forth to the end customer. Bringing it back to HR, this digital revolution that we're I wouldn't even say we're in the midst of. I think we're still relatively new to it, if I'm being honest, within Airbus. I think the challenge for you as a company is, where do you want to draw the line between talking to robots and actually having a customer people-centric offering? And I think, is there a place for digital workers? For sure. We're experimenting with cobots, we're experimenting with other artificial intelligence offerings within the HR domain. We're looking at virtual reality in terms of how that can add to the recruitment process, to the development process. I must admit I was a bit skeptical until I had a shot at it. And then when you're in a virtual reality scenario, your true personal inhibitions come out, and you can find out a lot more about the individual than the old desktop exercises that you used to see at assessment centres, for example. So lots of really good offerings. I think how we take that forward in terms of the services that we offer to our managers, to our employees, and what we can digitalise is immense, without a doubt. But at the end of the day, I think it's really, really important to understand that no matter what, at the core of HR is people. And we're in a people-related business. And you need to have that human touch, and that needs to continue alongside digital offerings.
All right, Dawn, how about you? Are you using software in HR as sort of the digital robots? Do things in what?
I think, first of all, if I talk about digital in the construction sector as a whole, over the next 10 years, there's an awful lot of talk about moving to digital methods of construction per se, and ultimately replacing some people, and also many more off-site manufacturing methods of construction, whereby robots will make stuff, or certainly parts, or in some cases whole buildings, and then we'll simply be able to move them and place them. So I think there are some quite different ways of working pending that in some ways are quite exciting for the sector, but from a people perspective presents some challenges in terms of trying to engage people in that particular agenda. We aren't quite at the point internally as an HR function where we would have what I would call true digital workers, but I mentioned at the start the type of environments our people are working in actually make the importance of technology to their employee experience and making that day-to-day experience of being an employee with us and in our sector easier quite key. So we focus very much on using technology to really automate some of those basic tasks that historically an HR function would have probably done on behalf of an employee, or we would have expected a line manager to do. All of our people now have on-site technology that they can use in various forms to do basic stuff like, report if they need a holiday, report if they have days off sick, all of that sort of stuff. And to some of you out there, you might think, well, that's kind of basic stuff, isn't it? That's quite hard to achieve, for example, if you're stood up a huge scaffolding platform at 2:00 in the morning because you're on a run of 7 night shifts and dealing with high voltage electricity. So that
And I hope they're safely secure.
all of that. And of course, you have your harness on and everything.
Good.
But, the availability of that technology to you to enhance your employee experience and enable you to do your job in the most efficient way is absolutely key. So we now have completely technology-enabled self-service in HR. Is that true digital workers? I guess not. But it's probably in our sector the first move towards that. And I think if you combine that with the vision of the industry that I mentioned, with digital methods of construction, many of you will have heard of something called business information modelling, known as BIM, where actually now we can simply, at a touch of a button, predict what a building, its green credentials, sustainability measures, carbon footprint can look like before we've even started building it. I think a sector that quite rightly you described as being old school in 10 years' time will be completely different through technology to where it is today. And I think that's quite an exciting agenda for HR to be a part of, actually.
But it will lead to the wholesale destruction of hundreds of human jobs, thousands of human jobs, just at your firm, let alone across the industry. So, we're now entering a question that's more of a philosophical question. So I'm going to ask Indy, because you're in a nonprofit, so you can be more philosophical. We're in this so-called fourth industrial revolution. I'm sure you've heard the term in the business school community that everyone's talking about it. And we're going to displace hundreds of thousands of workers. So the complexity of technology is even leading to more displacement, because not all of those workers may be able to deal with the technology. The server who used to work at Wetherspoons in the UK or wherever, it's been replaced by an iPad that you use to order your meal. So with these areas, the workers may have trouble catching up. What should the responsibility of the corporate employer be to reskill or redeploy these workers? Okay, and I'll open up to the other panelists as well, but what should the responsibility of the employer be if you're about to decimate an entire factory by implementing robots? What do you do with all the workers?
Yeah.
Is there a responsibility?
So maybe in answer to the
Now,
question,
bear in mind, I had Paul Friedman.
Yeah.
I had Milton Friedman at Wharton School as a lecturer, where he said there was no responsibility.
So no, there is responsibility, because the employer is an integral part of what society is today. So there is a responsibility. But let's keep the question in context, which is, firstly, around 70% of the people that have ever lived in this world are alive today. There are more people at work today than ever before. Technological revolution, 3 times that it's happened, the 4th time it will happen, but the 3 times it's happened has created more jobs, not less jobs. If you take a single country like India, its planned pessimistic growth at the moment is 250,000 people will come into the wealth economy who don't actually do any work today over the next 25 years. That's pessimistic. So half of Europe gets recreated. So just to keep context in terms of the number of jobs that are out there and the types of jobs. Now why is this? It's because obviously behind every technological development has been a whole load of individuals that have been in jobs. They've just been in different types. Now, if I take my first job in my time, it was with National Power, and I was in the middle of what was a miners' strike, where we had miners outside the power stations, and there was the whole issue of the coal industry. Now, actually, what happened is the coal industry went, all the jobs went, and there was an issue about reskilling. But what was that essentially about? At that time, there was one very important thing, which was geography. The people who would lose their jobs wouldn't be in the position where jobs were going to be recreated. Now, what technology allows us to do today is to say, we can actually recreate jobs, and actually, it doesn't matter where you are. If you can reskill yourself, you can do it from there. So, and of course, we talk about that globally, don't we? So I think, first of all, the fourth revolution is sort of a positive. I think the other positive is those that will be caught up in it will be having different backgrounds to many of us in this room, because, you know, there's not many of us in this room that were born in the year 2000 and after. And thirdly, what I would say is absolutely there is a shared responsibility between the employer, the organizations that are restructuring, and governments in whatever form they come in. Absolute joint responsibility. And in fact, if I was today running government, I'd be placing more onus on the employers. You know, it's so much more easier for me to make people redundant and not think about why I need to retrain these people. They make it easy for me, quite frankly, and I think there's more onus on governments to make it more of a responsibility over employers on how they think about retraining before they get to that redundancy point. Because there are more employees today who are retrainable than ever before. So that's philosophical, but also then linked in with the reality of hard-nosed information. There's very little data out there that says society as a whole created less jobs as a result of technology. The number of people working in the telecom industry today is something like 50 times the number of people that worked in the coal mining industry.
I mean, it's quite interesting. You know, philosophically, what would I say? I would say any good shepherd knows that unless he takes care of his flock, then his access to the market is gone, and he won't be able to put money in his pocket and food on the table, philosophically. But picking up on your point about government and the responsibility we've got, I think a couple of points. One, there's the employee perception and there's the candidate perception about good corporate citizenship. And if you're looking to attract candidates in the future, the way you can damage your brand is by tackling that type of issue incorrectly. So I think there is a responsibility on employers as part of an ecosystem, as part of a good corporate citizen agenda to take care of its flock. Where I maybe challenge you a little bit is on government, because I've been challenging government in the UK who have come out with with the CBI and with the TUC, a new training levy, a new training fund. And the crazy thing about the thinking is it's for people who are out of work trying to get into work. And my challenge to the government is, in this new world of digitalisation and this new world of having to upskill existing employees, wouldn't it be better to use the money to help change the dynamics inside the organisation than then have people be cast out of the organisation and then try to find their way back into the organisation? It's kind of the logic just doesn't kind of resonate with me. And I realise that employers have a responsibility to upskill and to invest. But I think there needs to be a little bit of sensibility in that whole area of support to industry, support to construction, to how do you tackle the overall challenge of having to need to upskill.
So does anyone know, what was the first industry where you find rampant use of artificial intelligence? Correct answer is politics. Okay, all right. So and by the way, there is no such thing as artificial intelligence. Your vendors are lying to you. It's not intelligent. Intelligence requires perception, it requires judgment, it requires the ability to improvise. What you're using is machine learning, which is, and I wrote a column about this, where it's essentially observe and repeat. Okay, now when you were kids, your mother used to say, is that like monkey see, monkey do? Does that sound intelligent to any of you? Now, it can do amazing things, and you can teach a computer to drive in a matter of hours. which is amazing, all right? Much faster than you could teach a human brain. But it is not intelligent. It cannot judge. So I think, Dawn, were you going to say something about Mark's comment?
Yeah, I was. I mean, and also one of yours, actually, Elliot, you mentioned that, you know, some of the changes, for example, in construction and the digital stuff I mentioned will lead to the destruction of jobs. I think probably the opposite, because we have a very well publicised skill shortage, not just in the UK.
Yeah.
So that's why I really resonate with Mark's point, which sort of says, actually, people's jobs will change, but we will still have jobs for those people. They're just going to be very different jobs. And therefore, government funding through organisations like the CITB absolutely needs to be channeled towards us helping them to make that transition without a doubt. But it certainly isn't having about, you know, it certainly isn't about having less people for those jobs. The jobs will just be different. And some of you may have seen it, but I think it was something that was actually done by Google or an organisation like that very recently, where it said, you know, your average kind of millennial will be doing a job in 10 years' time that actually just doesn't exist today. And I think that's a case in point, really.
So, Megan, you know, I know your company's, you know, sort of focused on technology. If you're using big data analytics and machine learning in your company, what steps are you taking as internal HR to make sure that the service providers or the vendors that you're using are getting the right answer from the data that they're pulling, and they're not compromised by legacy bias issues, which we know have been a problem, or bad data? How does HR manage that?
Yeah, I think some basic steps. I think one is just make sure that there's time, right? You never want to be in a time crunch when you're analyzing data, because usually you find things that you didn't know you'd find, and you need to ask about 10 more questions before you actually know what it's telling you, right? So what we try to do is plan to have enough time for the analysis. And then there's two pieces. One is, I think, have people interpret the data who aren't close to the data, because they're going to be more objective in observing what it's telling you. So if you use people, let's say, who are in talent management, who are working on succession planning to analyze the reason why succession plans are weak within a certain region, and they've been working in that region, they're going to have bias. It's normal. It's learned, right? So I think also making sure that you involve people who aren't as close to the circumstances, because they'll be more objective. And then I think the third thing is using people who have diverse perspectives in general, right? And really that helps us be open to what the data could be telling us and what we might need to do with the data. So I think those are the three steps that I've found, and not just at LumaLEDs, but also at Philips, have helped us get the most out of this type of work.
And you have something to add?
No, I was just listening to what everyone was saying, because I was just, I recently had a criticism by one of our academics that
really shocking.
you were
shocking.
And he said you're just a bunch of robots in HR with the same answer each time. So I'm just wondering now, with this artificial intelligence, whether I've managed to find how humans might become robots the other way around. That was all.
Yeah.
Let me move on to one of the things that we've sort of touched on, and I'll go to Mark and Dawn on this. And I talked a little bit about this last night. You just heard my joke about artificial intelligence. I've become cynical as I've gotten older, and I'm not even that old yet, about like government regulations. And we have this in the States, I see it in other geographies, all these bizarre interlocking regulations, if you will, some of which in the city of Philadelphia, there is a requirement that you post certain signage that's forbidden by the state in which Philadelphia is sitting, right? So it's just crazy. So what are you doing? And Mark and Dawn, you're in heavily regulated industries. I mean, construction and aircraft manufacturing. So what are you doing, to manage regulatory compliance? And, we've got, I referred to GDPR last night, for those of you who were not at the gala, as a regulation that should be called generally dumb and pretty redundant, right? So my bias is clear in my feeling about some of the regulations. Not that data privacy is not important. It's just you don't write a law that's so ambiguous that it can be interpreted 1,000 ways. So what are you doing, Mark? Okay. Mark, why don't we start with you? What are you doing to manage regulation?
I think regulation hits you in many different ways. Just like risk hits you every day of your life, it's how you mitigate that risk that's important. If I take GDPR, does it prevent you from communicating to employees, to candidates, in a way which we used to do, maybe. But how do you mitigate it? How do you fix the central challenge that regulations present you with? And the importance of managing data, the importance of ensuring that it's stored correctly, the importance of ensuring that your managers, your recruiting teams understand the consequences of getting it wrong. And people are becoming, I think, much more conscious of their own personal data and how that personal data can be misused. You look at Cambridge Analytics, you look at Facebook, you had British Airways getting fined, what was it, 183 million by having some data breaches. You face a penalty of, was it 20 million euros or 4% of your worldwide turnover, technically, if you get it wrong. So you have to adapt your thinking. You have to put in place the necessary training and awareness, for sure. And you need to, above all else, make sure that your IT systems are secure. You need to make sure that your service providers are GDPR compliant as well. So it puts another onus and responsibility on you to do further auditing of your supply chain to make sure in HR terms, so any payroll providers, any pension providers, any third-party service providers that you have to go in there and check. You have to make sure it's correct. And then just when you think you've got it all cracked, you then have a cyber security attack. And we are prone to numerous attacks on a daily basis. So you have to make sure you have a robust system, IT solutions that can fend off hackers. So you employ hackers to try and hack your systems to improve the quality of your systems,
Right.
so that you don't have third-party countries trying to access data. Lots of different things.
Dawn, how about you? What are you doing?
I think maybe some of what I'm about to say comes from the nature of the sector I work in, but a lot of this legislative and regulatory compliance is only as complicated, I think, as you choose to make it. And a good example, again, I mentioned GDPR yet again. We commissioned, a really detailed report telling us all the potential impacts on us, all of the stuff that we needed to do, that ran into 51 pages. And it was quite helpful from the point of view of explaining the law and all of that sort of stuff, but didn't really have a practical angle on what it really meant for us. So one of the offerings I would have is how do you make that reality in your organisation? Well, get people involved in interpreting that who are actually, for example, people handling some of that sensitive data every day. What does it actually mean? And what we ended up with was actually a 7-step bit of guidance which sits on one page around GDPR. And actually, if you follow those 7 steps, and we encourage our people who handle data, for example, that's considered sensitive, to just basically ask themselves 7 questions. And then actually, we even said to our lawyers, if we do these things, have we done everything we possibly can to be GDPR compliant around sensitive data? And the answer was yes. And it all comes from taking that practical mindset on, all of the detail that's out there, looking at what you actually do as an organisation and how you do it, and getting the people involved who have the responsibility for handling that stuff to say, what does it mean to you and how are you going to make that work? So I think there has to be some sense applied to things that can be made overcomplicated depending on the business you're in.
And we're going to do a story in HRO Today about what those 7 steps are that you're recommending.
I can send you it with pleasure.
Complexity, the simplification of complexity is genius.
Yeah.
I really believe that, right? It's very difficult. Anyone else on how do you manage compliance or whatever? So let me get to the sort of the last question. I'll go to all the panelists on this. Now, I'll probably go to you last, Mark. Mark is an example. There are very few, a handful of examples, Ursula Burns at Xerox, et cetera, of people who went from HR into an executive general management or chief executive role. You'll see people move from the CFO's slot, division head slot, head of sales, to the CEO role. but you don't see HR doing it that often. So I'm going to start with Indy because you're supposed to be educating the next generation of HR people at LSE. So now that we're well past the discussion of seat at the table at this point. Why is that rare? Okay, and will it be more common in the future for HR to cross into general management? And if so, what are the things that HR executives should do today to prepare themselves for that opportunity? And I'll go to Mark last because you actually did it. Now you're back in full-time HR, but what will it become more common for HR to move into the executive role? And what do people need to do to get that to happen?
Yeah. Well, we'll all answer it a different way, but the way I would answer it is, firstly, one of the reasons this doesn't happen is because it is increasingly becoming more and more important, whether it's right or wrong, for global organizations to have general managers or chief executives that have a grasp of finance. And often that gets interpreted in terms of financial qualifications. Yeah, and that comes from regulatory process, etc. A second reason is that actually, as a variety of professional bodies in human resources, we have not got ourselves up to the standard as many other professional bodies. So, for example, if we were the equivalent of the accountancy bodies in UK, in order to dismiss somebody, you would need somebody who's at least a member of the CIPD to have been involved in the dismissal decision. So unless we can't get ourselves up to that level, then we don't have. Thirdly, I think there is, as much as every single bit of the sort of the global administrative function needs human resources and sees its importance, there is actually even today an act of courageism for a board to promote a human resources director into that general manager position. And I think that's seen as, A, because there's a bias against human resources. Two, there is a big unconscious bias around the fact that it's a profession which has a large number of women, and the boards that we are in still have a large number of men. And I think there's a sort of dichotomy that exists in terms of exactly what human resources is. So I think there's a sort of macro picture, which interestingly enough is being repeated in the new environments and the new cultures. So even if you go to India and you go to Vietnam and you go, the Western model is being repeated and those biases are coming through. So I think at a macro level, they might be some of the reasons. They're reasons that are there to tackle and challenge so that more of us can get in the position that Mark is in.
Dawn, what do you think?
I think human resources professionals at all levels tend to underestimate and often forget the breadth of exactly what we do exposes you to. And let me give you an example of what I mean. We had a good discussion yesterday in one of the roundtables about talent acquisition technology and things. And that's a project I've been involved in very recently in my own organisation. That took me into getting involved in the procurement agenda, actually, when we looked at, what we bought, how, who. It took me into the IT agenda around what we wanted that system to do technically and what it needed to interface with. It took me into finance when I put the business case together. But actually, our automatic default too often, I think, particularly in public, is to just talk about the human resource processy side of that. Rather than the broad variety of things you actually have to do to make the ultimate technical HR thing actually happen. So I think that's something that we can do as a profession much better to educate our own businesses who maybe at board level, as Indy's indicated, don't kind of understand the roles still. And how it needs to operate. I think also based on personal experience and that of lots of colleagues, I think there's real value from taking things like non-executive directorships where you can, which completely take you out of what I would call your technical HR comfort zone and make you genuinely responsible, including in most cases with statutory responsibilities for things that you do not do day to day. And it really tests your thinking around how an organisation should be run, some of the responsibilities that you have and interfacing with lots of other functions really. So I think there's more we can do from a personal perspective as well as describing our own roles actually.
Megan? Let's see how controversial you'll get.
Well, no, let's see how it goes. But, I have a few thoughts on this. I think one is some people just don't want that role, right? So as I shared, I said, I love HR. I feel like I hit the career jackpot in finding this profession. And I think there are a lot of HR professionals I've met in my career who feel the same way, who just love this work and aren't aspiring for CEOs. So I think that's one. I've seen HR professionals move into CEO roles very intentionally in kind of two paths. I think one is early in their career, they intentionally expose themselves to many functions, right? When we build leaders, I don't put a lot of just finance people into CEO roles. You have them rotate early in their career and then take a P&L general management role before they go into a CEO role. So I think it's unlikely to have a really good CEO who hasn't had a lot of different functional experiences. And I don't know if HR people are managing their careers in that way, right? And then I think the last thing I'll say is I have seen a few HR professionals go into CEO roles very naturally, right? Where it's either because it's a business that they're extremely passionate about, or it's an HR-centric business. Like I have a friend and colleague who started an HR software company where she's going to become the CEO of that business, right? So it's building on the HR experience that she has, but she's able to be the chief executive officer, and I see that happening more naturally as well. So those are some of my thoughts. Yep.
All right, Mark.
I can only give you my own experience and my own advice, which is if you're an HR professional, you're only going to be limited by your own personal challenges and your own personal desires. And I take your point about it might not be for everyone. Personally, I think I've got the best of both worlds. I still dabble in HR, and I get to run a business as well and be on that stage where you feel you're really making a difference. And I think, like Dawn said, if you want to grow in that direction, then I recommend a couple of things. One would be get to know your business, the end-to-end process, get to know your markets, get to know your products, get to know your finances, because that all helps build credibility in the eyes of decision makers. And then, as you say, test yourself in a way which might be uncomfortable. Step out of your comfort zone, go and work in operations, learn what it feels like to be on the shop floor, managing large teams of people, if you're in that kind of industry. And then the other key thing is Dawn mentioned as well, I think, take opportunities that present themselves, like non-executive directors, become a trustee of a pension scheme, become, in essence, running your own mini business, watch how others do it, learn from them, and then it's quite easy actually, because then all you do is surround yourself with really good experts, and you just provide the opportunity to join the dots to help them see the bigger picture. And obviously how you interact with them and build confidence in them that you can bring something else to the party.
All right, excellent. Well, we've given you a lot to think about this morning. I want to thank our panelists, Cindy Sear of the London School of Economics, Dawn Moore of Morgan & Sindall, Megan Giannini of LumaLeds, and Mark Stewart of Airbus. Thank you so much to our panel. Good job.